In 2010, Dubai was a rapidly expanding city, known for its skyscrapers, luxurious developments, and constant flow of migrant workers who helped sustain the city's growing economy. Among the thousands of domestic helpers arriving from different parts of the world was Maria, a woman seeking steady work, financial security, and a chance to support her family back home. Like many others, she found employment as a live-in helper for a household in Dubai, performing routine duties and maintaining a predictable daily schedule. For those who knew her, Maria was described as reliable and consistent. She maintained regular communication with her family abroad, followed a structured routine in her workplace, and rarely caused concern to her employers or those around her. Her disappearance would soon stand in stark contrast to this dependable pattern of behavior. On an ordinary day in early 2010, Maria went about her usual tasks, cleaning, organizing, and assisting with household responsibilities. There was nothing unusual in her actions that morning or afternoon, and those in the home recalled nothing alarming in the hours leading up to her disappearance. But later that evening, when she failed to return to the residence as expected, her absence raised immediate concern. For a domestic helper working under fixed schedules and established expectations, being unaccounted for even for a few hours is uncommon. What followed was a series of actions taken first by the household she worked for, and then by community members and authorities. Attempts to contact her went unanswered. Her belongings remained untouched. No one could confirm where she had gone after completing her final known tasks. A straightforward day had ended with a silence that quickly became worrisome. This documentary reconstructs the events of Maria's last known movements, based on employer statements, embassy involvement, community accounts, and available investigative records. We explore how the missing person report was filed, how the early search unfolded, and what efforts were made by Dubai police to locate her. Using verified facts and procedural information, we trace the development of the investigation, the leads that surfaced, and the challenges that investigators encountered along the way. The story of Maria's disappearance reflects not only the vulnerability of domestic workers abroad, but also the structural difficulties that can arise when a migrant worker goes missing in a foreign country. This documentary presents the case step by step, focusing on the official actions taken, the evidence reviewed, and the gaps that remain. We avoid speculation and stick to verifiable information, allowing the facts to guide the narrative from the initial disappearance to the ongoing status of the case. Maria was one of the thousands of women who traveled to Dubai during the late 2000s in search of stable employment and a better financial future. Like many domestic helpers working abroad, she left her home country with the hope of earning enough to support her family, provide education for relatives, and build a more secure life. Her journey was similar to many migrant workers who traveled through recruitment agencies that arranged household employment in the United Arab Emirates. Maria arrived in Dubai sometime before 2010 and was placed in a private household as a full-time, live-in domestic helper. Those who worked with her described her as quiet, disciplined, and committed to completing her tasks carefully. She followed a structured routine, which included cleaning, organizing, washing, and assisting with general household duties. Her job required long hours, but she performed her tasks steadily and without complaint, according to those familiar with her work. Her lifestyle in Dubai was predictable. Domestic helpers typically have limited mobility outside their employers' homes, and Maria was no exception. Her outings were usually short, supervised, or scheduled around essential errands. She had little opportunity for extensive social interaction beyond neighboring helpers or workers she occasionally met during supply runs or brief moments of free time. Despite this, she maintained regular communication with her family in her home country. Phone calls or messages were exchanged whenever possible, helping her stay connected with those she supported financially. Her employers reported that she rarely deviated from her routine. She was consistent in her work habits, returned on time from errands, and avoided unnecessary absences. These stable patterns became important details later, as her disappearance did not align with her known behavior. Her predictability and responsibility at work made her absence stand out immediately as unusual. During her time in the household, Maria did not show signs of personal conflict or distress. No major disputes with her employers or coworkers were reported. There were no indications of plans to leave her job suddenly or travel elsewhere without notifying anyone. Her belongings remained neatly organized in the room she stayed in, and nothing suggested that she intended to depart voluntarily. These observations would later play a significant role in shaping the early stages of the investigation. Maria's personality, according to those who interacted with her, was calm and reserved. She was not known to engage in risky behavior or visit unfamiliar areas. She kept to herself and focused on her responsibilities. In the context of her work environment, she was considered trustworthy and dependable. Her disappearance, therefore, was not only unexpected but also out of character. In cases involving domestic helpers, sudden absences often raise immediate alarm due to the controlled nature of their daily lives. Maria's situation fit this pattern. Without financial independence, extensive social ties, or free mobility, the likelihood of her leaving on her own was viewed as low. This understanding informed how authorities and community members responded once her absence was noticed. As this documentary continues, understanding who Maria was, her lifestyle, her behavior, and her circumstances provides essential context for the unfolding events. Her case cannot be separated from the reality of domestic worker life in the Gulf region, where strict work conditions, limited personal freedom, and heavy responsibilities shape everyday experiences. Maria's story begins with her dedication to providing for her family and her commitment to her work. It is this background that makes her disappearance in 2010 both striking and deeply concerning. In the days leading up to her disappearance, Maria followed her normal routine, carrying out the responsibilities expected of her in the household where she worked. Domestic helpers in Dubai typically have structured workdays, and Maria's pattern reflected this predictability. Each morning began with cleaning tasks, preparing rooms, organizing living areas, and ensuring the home was in order before the family began their day. These duties formed the foundation of a daily schedule, and nothing in this period suggested any disruption or change in her behavior. On the day she was last seen, Maria's actions aligned with her usual responsibilities. According to household accounts, she completed her morning tasks without any signs of distress or irregularity. She interacted briefly with other staff members, maintained her quiet demeanor, and carried out her duties steadily. No disagreements, unusual conversations, or personal issues were noted by anyone who saw or interacted with her. The environment appeared calm, and her conduct remained consistent with her established habits. Later in the afternoon, Maria was assigned routine errands outside the residence, jobs such as disposing of trash, buying small household supplies, or assisting with deliveries. These tasks were not considered unusual and formed part of her standard responsibilities as a helper. She left the home as expected and completed these tasks promptly, according to employer reports. There were no indications at that time that anything was wrong. Multiple individuals confirmed seeing Maria during these hours. These were brief encounters, a neighbor noticing her near the building entrance, a shopkeeper observing her making a small purchase, and a nearby resident recalling her walking along the pathway commonly used by domestic workers in the area. None of these witnesses described anything out of the ordinary. She was walking calmly, carrying out her regular duties, and displaying no signs of anxiety or urgency. These accounts formed the basis of the last verified sightings before her disappearance. In some instances involving missing workers, early signs of concern, such as unusual phone calls, emotional distress, or sudden changes in behavior, offer clues about what might come next. In Maria's case, there were none. She made no phone calls indicating worry. She did not mention any problems to fellow helpers. She left behind all of her belongings, including clothes, documents, and personal items. She made no withdrawals from her savings, and there was no evidence of her seeking transportation out of the area. When her routine tasks were completed, no one observed her encountering anyone suspicious, deviating from her path, or entering an unfamiliar vehicle. The route she took was a common one, used daily by workers around the neighborhood. Even the timing of her movements matched her usual schedule, adding to the stability of her pattern. The last confirmed moment of Maria's day came from a household staff member who recalled seeing her return briefly toward the service area entrance of the residence. After this, her movements become unclear. It is not confirmed whether she re-entered the property or whether she stepped away again for an additional errand. This short span of time, between her last sighting and the moment her absence was noticed, would later become the central focus of police reconstruction efforts. By early evening, when Maria failed to appear in the household at the expected time, concern began to grow. Helpers in these roles typically do not disappear without notifying someone, and they rarely remain outside longer than permitted. Her employers attempted to contact her, but there was no response. As the hours passed, it became clear that something was wrong. The final confirmed activities of Maria's day remain critical to understanding what happened next. These routine actions, carrying out tasks, interacting with familiar faces, and returning toward the residence, represent the closing moments in a timeline that investigators later attempted to piece together. With no sign of conflict, no abrupt behavior, and no stated plans to leave, her disappearance became even more puzzling. Her last known movements formed the foundation of the investigation, shaping the questions that follow. Where did she go next? Who might have seen her after that final sighting? And at what point did her ordinary routine shift into a situation that would leave no clear trace behind? As evening approached on the day Maria was last seen, the routine rhythm inside the household where she worked began to shift. Domestic helpers in the UAE typically follow structured schedules, and by early evening, most of their tasks would either be completed or winding down. When Maria did not return at her usual time, her absence was noticed almost immediately by the other staff. It was out of character for her to be delayed, and the lack of communication raised early concern. At first, her employers assumed she might still be completing one of her assigned errands or assisting another staff member. Short delays were uncommon for Maria, but not impossible. Still, as more time passed, the initial uncertainty gave way to worry. Domestic workers rarely remain outside without explicit permission or clear purpose, and the longer she remained unaccounted for, the more unusual her absence seemed. Her employers attempted to contact her through the standard means available: calls to her mobile number, inquiries among neighbors, and checks through nearby street areas where she typically walked. None of these attempts yielded information. Her phone did not ring through, and there were no signs that she had passed by recently. With each unanswered call, the sense that something was seriously wrong began to grow. Inside her room, nothing suggested that she had left voluntarily. Her clothes were still neatly arranged, personal items were untouched, and her savings remained in place. There were no packed bags, no notes, and no signs of hurried movement. For investigators, this detail would later become significant. Most voluntary departures involve at least minimal preparation. Maria's room showed none. By late evening, the employers extended their search beyond the immediate neighborhood. Nearby streets were checked, small shops were questioned, and local workers were asked whether they had seen her. The area was familiar, and Maria's presence was well known among a handful of shopkeepers and helpers in the vicinity. Yet no one reported seeing her after her last confirmed sighting earlier that day. This absence of witnesses in a usually active area deepened the uncertainty surrounding her disappearance. When night arrived and there was still no sign of her, the household began to consider the possibility that something more serious had occurred. Under UAE labor regulations, employers are responsible for reporting missing domestic workers promptly, especially if the disappearance appears suspicious. But before contacting authorities, many households attempt to locate the missing helper themselves, hoping the situation will resolve without formal involvement. In Maria's case, this informal search produced no leads. The next morning, after a night with no communication and no confirmed sightings, her employers recognized that the situation had escalated beyond what they could resolve. Her absence by daylight, without explanation, luggage, or any attempt to return, was unprecedented. A missing person situation involving a domestic helper typically triggers concern quickly due to their limited freedom of movement, and Maria's case fit that pattern. Co-workers provided their statements to the employers, confirming the timeline of her last tasks and the last known moment she was seen approaching the service entrance area. No one reported hearing a disturbance or noticing anything unusual. There were no reports of strangers in the vicinity, no unusual vehicles noted, and no signs of forced interaction. The lack of clear indicators made the situation more mysterious rather than more understandable. When authorities were finally notified, the initial information they received was straightforward. A domestic helper had not returned home, had not been heard from, and had no known reason to disappear voluntarily. Police began with basic questions. When she was last seen, what tasks she had been doing, what she had taken with her, and who might have had contact with her that day. With little evidence available, the early hours of the disappearance relied entirely on statements from employers, co-workers, and neighbors. Maria's disappearance did not involve any dramatic incident, loud confrontation, or public disturbance. It unfolded quietly, in the space between ordinary tasks and an ordinary return home. This quiet, unremarkable transition from normal routine to unexplained absence is what makes many domestic worker disappearance cases difficult to trace. There is no clear moment when something visibly went wrong. By the end of the first 24 hours, Maria was officially considered missing. The lack of immediate evidence, combined with the predictable structure of her daily life, made her disappearance a matter of serious concern. The investigation into her last known movements would soon deepen, as authorities began their systematic efforts to reconstruct her steps and uncover what might have happened after her final confirmed sighting. In the first hours after Maria was officially declared missing, the search began with standard procedure. Missing person cases in the UAE typically start with establishing timelines, gathering statements, and checking all locations the missing individual was known to frequent. In Maria's case, this meant retracing the quiet, ordinary path she took every day, one that had suddenly become the center of a mystery. Authorities first collected all available details from her employers. They documented the exact time she was last seen, the clothes she was wearing, and the tasks she was completing before she vanished. Every minute leading up to her disappearance was important. Investigators looked for gaps, inconsistencies, or anything that could indicate a shift in her route. None immediately appeared. With the statement in hand, officers began canvassing the surrounding area. Domestic workers in Dubai often walk between their workplace and nearby shops or service entrances, passing through the same corridors and outdoor paths daily. Investigators questioned security guards positioned near residential compounds, as they often notice unusual activity. But that day, no one reported seeing her after her last known moment. Cameras in some compounds were checked, but older residential areas, especially in 2010, did not always have strong CCTV coverage. The first phase of the search involved methodical door-to-door inquiries. Neighbors were asked whether they had noticed anything out of the ordinary. Shopkeepers from small groceries, laundries, and kiosks, places Maria sometimes visited, were questioned as well. Many remembered her routine friendliness, her consistency, and her polite greetings. But none could recall seeing her that afternoon or evening. The absence of a single sighting made the case more troubling. Police continued by confirming that Maria had not attempted to travel through any nearby public transport stations. Buses and metro systems in the UAE are monitored, but since she rarely used them alone, investigators treated this as a precautionary check. No authorities from bus stops or transport offices reported anyone matching her description. It appeared unlikely she had tried to leave the neighborhood willingly. Meanwhile, officers examined her room again, this time with investigative scrutiny. They looked for hidden notes, signs of distress, or any indication of a planned departure. None existed. Her personal savings were untouched, her clothing neatly in place, and her documents remained exactly where she kept them. To investigators, this strongly suggested that Maria did not choose to disappear and did not expect anything unusual to happen that day. By the second day, the police expanded their search radius. Nearby construction sites, open plots of land, parking areas, and service corridors were checked. These areas often go overlooked but can hold clues in disappearance cases. Search teams were sent through side streets, dumpsters, and rarely used stairwells of surrounding buildings. Nothing significant was found. Authorities also contacted local hospitals and clinics. It is standard procedure to check whether an unidentified patient had been admitted due to an accident or sudden medical emergency. All facilities verified that no one matching Maria's age, description, or facial features have been brought in. This eliminated the possibility of an unreported accident, narrowing the focus back to an unexplained disappearance. Her mobile phone records were requested, though such requests often take time. Early checks showed her phone had stopped responding shortly after she was last seen. The device did not appear active, suggesting it had been switched off, damaged, or taken. For investigators, this was a critical point. Most domestic workers keep their phones on at all times, especially if they are outside for work-related errands. A sudden shutdown was not normal. As the search entered its third day, the atmosphere within the household grew heavy. Domestic workers often share close bonds, and Maria's absence deeply affected those she worked alongside. Some described her as calm, reliable, and reserved. She was not someone who ventured out unnecessarily, nor someone who broke rules. This helped reinforce the growing belief that something had happened against her will. Authorities continued conducting interviews and gathering small pieces of information, hoping one lead would guide them closer to an answer. But with no physical evidence, no eyewitness reports, and no communication from Maria, the investigation faced a difficult and unsettling start. She had simply disappeared, quietly, without warning, and without leaving a trace. The early search efforts established one thing clearly. Whatever happened to Maria occurred between her last known sighting and her expected return home. That brief window of time, ordinary and uneventful, was now the focus of As the first several days passed with no significant discoveries, the disappearance of Maria shifted from a routine missing person inquiry into a more focused investigation. In Dubai, cases involving domestic workers received structured attention due to the vulnerable nature of their employment and living conditions. For investigators, the absence of evidence did not suggest a simple misunderstanding. It suggested the possibility of a serious event. The first major step taken by police was to reconstruct Maria's final movements in greater detail. Officers returned to the residential area with updated questions, this time concentrating on small, easily overlooked details: unfamiliar vehicles seen in the area, unknown individuals, unusual sounds, or disruptions in routine. Sometimes what appears unimportant can later become a pivotal clue. Security guards working rotating shifts were interviewed again. Several guards admitted that they had been occupied with internal tasks at the time Maria would have passed by, meaning brief windows existed where she could have crossed certain points unnoticed. Investigators logged these gaps carefully, identifying them as potential moments when she could have been intercepted or approached. CCTV footage was revisited with a more meticulous eye. In 2010, many private buildings in the UAE had limited camera coverage, but the footage that did exist was re-examined frame by frame. Police looked for indirect clues, shadows, partial movements, or vehicles entering side lanes. Although no clear sighting of Maria emerged, some short segments were flagged for closer study. These included vehicles parked unusually close to service routes and brief moments where visibility was obstructed. Parallel to the physical investigation, authorities began building a timeline of Maria's personal life. Interviews with co-workers revealed that she had no conflicts with staff or residents. She rarely went out alone and avoided unfamiliar areas. Investigators also reached out to her family in her home country through her employers. Communication records confirmed that she had not sent any messages or attempted to call home since she disappeared. This strengthened the belief that something involuntary had occurred. Her phone records were finally received, offering more insight, even if limited. The data confirmed that her phone had been active shortly before her disappearance, but then shut down abruptly. There were no outgoing calls or messages that suggested distress. No suspicious numbers contacted her in the days leading up to the event. Instead, the silence of the phone raised an important question: who turned it off, and why? Another angle investigators explored was the possibility of an accident in areas not accessible to the public. Some buildings have maintenance shafts, restricted service hallways, or basement access points that staff use. These could become hazardous if someone entered unintentionally or if visibility was low. Search teams inspected these places again, but once more, they found no trace of Maria. With each passing day, the absence of evidence became a pattern in itself. In many disappearance cases, something, anything, a piece early, a dropped belonging, a witness report, a camera frame, or message. In Maria's situation, every avenue returned empty. For investigators, this lack of clues suggested that whatever happened was swift, controlled, and left little room for escape or attention. This growing concern pushed the police to widen their focus further. They began reviewing reports of suspicious incidents in nearby districts, loitering individuals, recent complaints, or prior cases with similar circumstances. While these reports did not directly link to Maria, they helped investigators map behavioral patterns in the surrounding area. At the same time, tension within the household increased. Domestic workers who lived alongside Maria described sleepless nights and constant worry. They replayed conversations in their minds, searching for anything they may have missed. Comments about fear, discomfort, or unusual behavior from strangers. But everyone described the same thing. Maria had shown no signs of distress before she disappeared. As the investigation deepened, one uncomfortable reality set in. The lack of evidence meant that the case could move in several directions, each equally troubling. A voluntary departure seemed highly unlikely. An accident would have likely been discovered. That left the possibility of external involvement, something authorities could not yet confirm but could no longer ignore. By the end of this phase, investigators were left with a broader map of possibilities but no definitive answer. The mystery surrounding Maria was no longer just a matter of where she went. It was now a question of what happened in the short, silent window when she vanished. As the days continued to pass without a clear breakthrough, the investigation into Maria's disappearance entered a more complex phase. The early search had produced silence. No sightings, no calls, no clues. That silence pushed investigators to widen their scope and examine any emerging leads, no matter how small or uncertain. What followed was a period marked by scattered information, conflicting statements, and unsettling possibilities that reshaped the direction of the case. The first promising lead came from a shopkeeper in a small grocery store near the residential area. During a follow-up inquiry, he recalled seeing someone resembling Maria pass by his window on the day she disappeared. But his memory was vague, and he could not confirm the exact time. He wasn't sure whether it was that day or earlier in the week. Investigators documented his statement but treated it cautiously. Memory can be unreliable, especially when days have passed. The sighting was logged as inconclusive. Another potential lead emerged from a taxi driver who reported seeing a woman with a similar build walking quickly toward a side street used as a shortcut by domestic workers. The driver couldn't describe her face clearly, nor could he confirm her clothing. The uncertainty made it difficult to determine whether this was truly Maria or simply someone with a similar appearance. Still, police added it to the growing list of possibilities. Investigators also began examining nearby construction zones. These areas often involve large groups of workers, constant movement, and minimal supervision. In some cases, individuals may pass through unnoticed. Workers were questioned one by one. A few claimed they noticed a woman walking past the site earlier that afternoon, but none could identify her. No physical evidence was found in the area. Once again, the information was suggestive, but not definitive. Another angle explored involved reports of unfamiliar men seen near residential alleys around the time Maria vanished. One resident mentioned seeing a man standing near a service entrance, appearing as though he were waiting for someone or observing the area. His description was vague, offering little for investigators to follow. Police searched for him but found no one matching the account. Whether he was connected to the disappearance or merely passing by remained unknown. Around this time, investigators revisited her employer and co-workers to gather deeper insight into Maria's emotional state. Sometimes, people close to the missing individual recall small details only after some time has passed. But even during these extended conversations, nothing suggested she had been planning to leave or meeting anyone unfamiliar. Those who knew her described her as quiet, respectful, and cautious, someone unlikely to take risks. With leads thinning and pressure increasing, authorities began exploring darker possibilities. One theory considered was human trafficking, a concern present in many countries with large populations of migrant workers. However, Investigators found no evidence suggesting contact with recruitment agents or suspicious individuals prior to her disappearance. Maria also had no history of attempting to change employers or seek new opportunities, an important factor in ruling out certain trafficking scenarios. Another possibility involved accidental injury in a restricted area or isolated corridor. But multiple searches, including repeated sweeps by specialized teams, found no indication she had fallen or been trapped. It became increasingly unlikely that an accident had caused a disappearance. As each lead produced more questions than answers, the emotional burden on those close to her deepened. Her co-workers struggled with feelings of helplessness and fear. Many began avoiding walking alone, worried that if something had happened to Maria without witnesses or noise, it could also happen to anyone else. The quiet community became tense, rumors spread, and speculation grew. Meanwhile, investigators focused on the small details that had surfaced. The possible sightings, the undefined gaps in time, and the presence of unfamiliar individuals all created a patchwork of possibilities. Nothing was confirmed, but everything hinted at one troubling pattern. If Maria encountered someone that day, it may have happened quickly, quietly, and deliberately. By this stage, the investigation was no longer simply about locating a missing domestic worker. It had become a complex search for truth in a case where every lead pointed in a different direction. And although each possibility remained uncertain, the emerging hints suggested that Maria's disappearance was not accidental and not voluntary. Something, or someone, intervened in those final moments of her known routine. As the investigation reached its second week, the sense of urgency surrounding Maria's disappearance intensified. Every passing day without answers made the case feel heavier, and investigators knew that the more time elapsed, the more difficult it would be to uncover what truly happened. But just when the inquiry seemed stuck in a cycle of repeated interviews and inconclusive leads, a new development emerged, one that offered both hope and caution. The first significant shift came when authorities received updated mobile network data. It showed that her phone had briefly connected to a cell tower several kilometers from the residential area. The connection was brief, just a single ping, but it indicated that her phone, or someone carrying it, had moved. Investigators immediately dispatched officers to the surrounding neighborhoods associated with that signal. They searched alleys, construction sections, parking lots, and public paths. But once again, nothing concrete surfaced. It was unclear if the ping came from a phone being switched on momentarily, or if it was just a delayed network signal. It was a lead, but a fragile one. Soon after, another potential breakthrough came from a resident who returned from travel and reported something unusual. He recalled seeing a woman, possibly Maria, near a service entrance on the day she disappeared, speaking with someone. The man couldn't recall many details. The person she spoke to was partly turned away, and the conversation seemed brief. But he remembered a gesture. The woman he saw appeared hesitant, stepping back before she was approached again. This detail caught investigators' attention. If accurate, it suggested she may not have been alone during the critical window. But the lack of clarity made it difficult to rely on. The resident couldn't confirm if it was truly Maria, nor the exact time. Investigators logged it as a potential encounter, but one with too many gaps to build a firm conclusion. Another possible lead came from a delivery driver. During questioning, he mentioned seeing an unfamiliar vehicle parked near the service corridors around the time she vanished. He couldn't recall the plate number, but he remembered it was an unmarked white van, common in the UAE due to frequent deliveries and maintenance work. Still, police checked nearby businesses to identify any contractors operating in the area that day. Most were accounted for. A few could not be verified, but no evidence tied any of them to Maria. Despite these promising threads, none developed into solid evidence. The leads offered direction, but no resolution. Each raised new questions. Was the phone ping a coincidence? Or was the sighting truly Maria? Was the white van connected, or simply routine traffic? Investigators pressed on, hoping one detail would align with another, forming the first clear picture of what happened. They cross-referenced the phone data with the timing of the possible sightings. But even these comparisons yielded inconsistencies. The timeline remained fragmented. Meanwhile, The emotional tension among those who knew Maria deepened. For her colleagues, each new update brought hope, followed quickly by disappointment. The uncertainty weighed on them. For the authorities, the pressure mounted. With no evidence of a voluntary disappearance and no signs of an accident, the possibility of foul play became harder to ignore. As the investigation pushed forward, the team also revisited previously dismissed possibilities. Sometimes, a detail overlooked early on becomes meaningful in hindsight. But repeated searches and interviews continued to produce the same outcome. No trace, no object left behind, no final communication. By the end of this phase, investigators were left in a familiar position, caught between the promise of breakthroughs and the reality of dead ends. Each clue carried potential, yet none brought them closer to understanding what truly happened to Maria. The case, once hopeful for quick resolution, now stood on the edge of uncertainty. And with no definitive answers emerging, the question lingered heavier than ever. Was a breakthrough approaching, or was the investigation drifting into another unresolved mystery? As weeks turned into months, the investigation into Maria's disappearance began to lose momentum. What started as an active search, fueled by urgency and a constant stream of interviews, slowly shifted into a case marked by silence. Leads had dried up, sightings faded, and the small clues that once seemed promising dissolved into uncertainty. Gradually, the investigation entered a phase that every missing person case fears. It began to go cold. In missing persons work, cold does not mean forgotten, but it does mean that progress becomes slow, unpredictable, and heavily dependent on chance. For investigators, this stage is one of the most difficult. Without new evidence or witnesses, and without any physical trace of Maria, the case could no longer sustain the large-scale searches it once demanded. Officers who had worked tirelessly were reassigned to newer investigations, while a smaller, rotational team kept Maria's file active. One major challenge was the absence of digital clues. In many modern investigations, phones, security cameras, and online communication create trails. But in 2010, and in the context of a domestic worker with limited technology use, those trails were minimal. Her phone never reconnected after the first unexplained ping. No financial activity appeared. No new records surfaced. Every electronic avenue that could have provided insight remained static. The community around her workplace and residence gradually returned to routine. Shopkeepers who once discussed her case stopped mentioning it. Residents who once provided statements moved on with daily life. Even her co-workers, though still deeply affected, found themselves returning to responsibilities that allowed little time for reflection. Yet beneath that surface, a quiet unease remained, because Maria had simply vanished, and no one could explain how. Authorities kept the file open. Periodically, they revisited previous interviewees, re-examined old camera footage, and followed up on distant reports of women found elsewhere in the region. Two such reports temporarily reignited hope, one in another emirate and another across the border, but neither case involved Maria. Each dead end added to the weight of the unknown. Her family, thousands of kilometers away, continued to seek updates. Communication between them and investigators became less frequent over time, not from unwillingness, but from the reality that there was nothing new to report. For families of missing persons, this is often the most painful stage, the waiting, the absence of closure, and the fear that the world is moving on without answers. In Dubai, Maria's name became another entry in a long list of unsolved disappearances. The lack of evidence meant that investigators could not close the case, but they also could not move it forward. With no suspect, no confirmed sighting, and no forensic trail, the mystery remained suspended, open, but stagnant. Still, the case was never formally abandoned. Periodically, investigators revisited the file, reviewing the timeline and exploring whether new technology or investigative methods could uncover something that had previously been missed. But as the years passed, nothing concrete surfaced. By this point, the unanswered questions far outnumbered the known facts. What happened in the short window between her last sighting and her expected return home? Did she encounter someone she knew, or someone completely unfamiliar? Or was her disappearance planned by another person? Or was it an isolated, opportunistic event? Without evidence, each question remained speculation. And as time moved on, the truth slipped further from reach. The case now stood as a stark reminder of how quickly and quietly a person can disappear, even in a populated and monitored environment. Without witnesses, without physical signs, without digital traces, an entire investigation can stall, leaving behind a story with no conclusion. Maria's disappearance remained, and still remains, an unresolved mystery. Maria's disappearance remains one of the unresolved cases involving domestic workers in Dubai. Over time, the lack of conclusive leads, absence of confirmed sightings, and limited physical evidence have all contributed to a challenging investigative environment. Despite the efforts of police authorities, embassy representatives, and community members, the case gradually became an example of how migrant workers can vanish without leaving a clear trace. The story illustrates the complexity of missing person investigations involving individuals with few personal resources, limited local connections, and restricted mobility outside their workplace. Domestic helpers often live where they work, making their movements predictable, and any departure from routine becomes significant. In Maria's case, this predictability emphasized the seriousness of her disappearance. Yet despite this, establishing what happened became difficult due to a lack of witnesses and the absence of surveillance footage capturing her final steps. The involvement of her home country embassy and migrant worker support groups helped keep her case alive for some time. But without new information, the investigation eventually reached a standstill. Families in such situations face ongoing uncertainty, often lacking closure or definitive answers. Maria's family, like many in similar cases, continued searching for updates long after official efforts slowed, relying on community networks, international contacts, and public awareness. Her disappearance raised broader questions about domestic worker protections, monitoring systems, and reporting procedures in the region. Since 2010, there have been efforts by various organizations to improve safety protocols, create better reporting channels, and enhance documentation requirements for domestic employees. While these developments do not solve the mystery of Maria's case, they reflect an ongoing commitment to increasing safety for workers in similar positions. As this documentary concludes, Maria's story remains a reminder of the silent risks faced by migrant workers throughout the Gulf region. Though the investigation did not lead to a definitive explanation, the case continues to underscore the importance of transparency, support systems, and timely reporting in missing person situations. Her disappearance is not forgotten, and its impact persists through the awareness it brought and the conversations it continues to inspire about worker safety and rights.